Imagine standing on the edge of a bridge at midnight with a heavy stone in your hand that you just can't seem to drop. That stone isn't a physical object, but a memory of a door you never opened or a word you never spoke. Most of us assume that our brains are built to store our achievements and our finished chapters like trophies on a shelf. But the cold, hard reality of neuroscience suggests something much more haunting. Your brain is actually a master architect of the incomplete. It builds elaborate, high-definition internal structures around the things you left hanging. It nurtures the what-ifs and the could-have-beens while letting the done deals fade into the gray fog of the past. This isn't just a quirk of your personality or a sign that you are prone to overthinking. It is a fundamental survival mechanism known as the Zeigarnik effect. This effect dictates that your subconscious mind will continue to chew on an unfinished task like a dog with a bone until it reaches a resolution. It is the reason you can't remember what you had for lunch 3 days ago, but you can remember the exact look on someone else's face when you almost told them you loved them, but stayed silent instead. To understand how this architecture of regret is built, we have to look at the story of a man named Elias. Elias was a brilliant architect himself, a man who spent his life finishing skyscrapers and bridges with mathematical precision. Yet, in his private life, Elias was a collector of fragments. His desk was littered with half-written notes and sketches of buildings that would never be built. For decades, Elias felt a physical weight in his chest whenever he passed a certain post office in his hometown. It wasn't because of anything that happened there, but because of what failed to happen. 20 years prior, he had stood in front of that blue mailbox with a letter addressed to a woman named Clara. The letter contained a confession that would have changed the trajectory of his entire existence. He stood there for 10 minutes, the paper crinkling under his thumb, before finally turning away and tucking the letter into his coat pocket. He eventually lost the letter, but he never lost the memory of the weight of it. In fact, that moment became the most vivid memory of his entire youth. While he forgot the details of his wedding day and the day he passed his exams, the image of that blue mailbox remained in 4K resolution in his mind. This is the Zeigarnik effect in its most primal, emotional form. Our brains are essentially biological computers that hate open loops. When a task is completed, our brain receives a hit of dopamine and essentially closes the file to save energy. But when a task is interrupted or left undone, the brain keeps that file open in the background of our consciousness. This background processing consumes an enormous amount of mental energy and creates a state of cognitive tension. Luma Zeigarnik, the Soviet psychologist who discovered this, noticed it first in a busy Viennese restaurant. She observed that waiters had incredible memories for complex orders that hadn't been paid for yet. They could remember every side dish, every drink, and every special request for a table of 12. However, the moment the bill was settled and the loop was closed, the waiters could no longer recall a single detail of what those people had eaten. The brain had literally deleted the information because it was no longer necessary for a pending action. This suggests that our memories are not built for nostalgia, but for utility. We remember what we haven't done because the brain thinks we still need to do it. For Elias, his brain didn't care about the buildings he had successfully finished because they were closed files. But that letter to Clara was an open loop that his subconscious was trying to solve for 20 years. It kept the memory fresh, painful, and intrusive as a way of nagging him to find a resolution. This creates a paradox where our failures and omissions become the structural pillars of our identity. We define ourselves not by the path we walked, but by the forks in the road where we stood still. Scientific research shows that this tension exists in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and executive function. When we leave something hanging, the prefrontal cortex stays on, sending signals to the rest of the brain to stay alert. This is why you feel a sense of unease when you leave the house wondering if you locked the door. It is the brain's way of maintaining a mental itch that can only be scratched by completion. But when the thing we left undone is a life-altering decision, the itch becomes a permanent scar. We are haunted by the ghosts of our unlived lives because our biology refuses to let us move on. This internal architecture is what makes us human, but it is also what makes us suffer. We are the only species that can be tortured by a reality that never actually happened. Throughout this exploration, we will see how Elias tried to dismantle his architecture of regret. We will look at the peer-reviewed studies that explain why your brain treats a missed opportunity as a physical threat. And we will learn how to finally close the loops that are draining our mental battery. By the end of this journey, you will understand that your regrets are not just mistakes. They are unfinished symphonies your brain is still trying to play. As Elias moved into the middle of his life, his architectural career reached its zenith. Yet his internal world felt increasingly like a construction site that had been abandoned overnight. Every time he sat in a quiet room, the memory of that unsent letter would pulse in his mind like a digital notification that couldn't be swiped away. This persistent mental intrusion is driven by what researchers call cognitive high gear, a state where the brain refuses to downshift into a resting state because it perceives an unresolved task as a survival priority. From an evolutionary standpoint, your ancestors needed to remember that they had started a fire or that a predator was still on the loose. The brain didn't develop to remember the berries you already picked. It developed to obsess over the berries you left behind because those are the ones that will keep you alive tomorrow. In the modern world, this survival mechanism has been hijacked by our social and emotional lives, leading to the architecture of regret. Elias found that he could remember the specific shade of ink on that letter S envelope more clearly than he could remember the faces of clients he had met just last week. This is because the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, works in tandem with the amygdala to tag unfinished business with emotional significance. When a task is completed, the tag is removed and the memory is archived in the long-term storage of the cortex, where it becomes harder to access. However, as long as the task remains unfinished, the memory stays in the active workspace of the brain, constantly refreshed by a loop of neural activity. Elias began to notice that this mental looping was affecting his physical health, causing tension in his shoulders and a persistent lack of focus during his design meetings. He was experiencing what psychologists call brain drain, where the energy required to keep these open loops active reduces the bandwidth available for new information. Scientific studies using fMRI scans have shown that people harboring significant regrets or unfinished goals have higher resting activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. This area is associated with self-referential thought, meaning their brains are literally spending more time thinking about themselves and their failures than the world around them. For Elias, every building he designed was an attempt to create the perfection he lacked in his personal history. He was trying to build his way out of the Zeigarnik effect, but the brain cannot be fooled by substitutions. You cannot close a loop regarding a relationship by finishing a project at work. The brain categorizes these tasks in different buckets. Research by Baumeister and Mazzucampo suggests that it isn't necessarily the action of finishing that the brain craves, but the creation of a concrete plan for resolution. They found that students who were interrupted during a task performed poorly on subsequent tests unless they were allowed to write down exactly when and how they would finish the interrupted task. This plan acted as a cognitive off switch, allowing the brain to finally release the information from its active workspace. Elias, however, had no plan for his regret. He only had the void where the action should have been. He began to research the work of Dr. Kenneth Savitsky, who explored why the regrets of inaction are so much more durable than the regrets of action. Savitsky's research confirmed that while we might feel bad in the short term for a mistake we made, those feelings fade as we rationalize or fix the error. But the things we didn't do, the regrets of inaction, grow larger over time because there is no data to contradict our imagination. When you do something and it fails, your brain has a closed loop of failure to process and eventually discard. When you do nothing, the loop remains open, and your imagination fills that void with an infinite series of perfect outcomes. Elias imagined that if he had sent the letter, he and Clara would have lived a life of cinematic bliss, an image that his brain maintained with agonizing detail. This is known as counterfactual thinking, where the brain creates an alternative reality that it treats as a missed destination rather than a fantasy. The neurotransmitter glutamate plays a key role here, keeping the neurons associated with that specific missed memory in a state of high excitability. This is why the regret feels electric. It is a literal surge of neurochemical activity that refuses to stabilize. The toll of this architectural ghosting became most apparent when Elias tried to form new connections. He found that he was comparing every new person he met to the idealized version of Clara that lived in his open loop, because the Zeigarnik effect keeps the memory of the incomplete task fresh. Elias's brain was treating a 20-year-old memory as if it were a current event. To his subconscious, he was still standing at that mailbox, and every day he didn't send the letter was a new day of failing the task. This leads to a state of chronic decision fatigue, where the brain is so tired from managing old loops that it struggles to make simple choices in the present. Elias would spend hours agonizing over the choice of a marble finish for a lobby, not realizing he was actually processing the exhaustion of a 2-decade-old hesitation. The brain's architecture is a zero-sum game. The more space you give to the ghosts of what you didn't do, the less space you have for the reality of what you are doing. Experiments have shown that people who are forced to keep a secret another form of an open loop actually perceive physical hills as steeper and distances as longer. Elias was carrying the weight of his unsent letter like a physical backpack, and it was slowing his gait through the actual world. He finally realized that to save his future designs, he had to stop being the architect of his past and become the demolition expert of his regrets. He needed to find a way to trick his brain into believing the loop was closed, even if the person on the other end was long gone. The human brain is often compared to a supercomputer, but in reality, it functions more like a high-end theater with a very limited number of seats on the stage. Every open loop or unfinished task takes up one of those seats, preventing new, more important actors from taking their place. Elias began to understand this during a particularly grueling project where his inability to choose a simple color palette led to a complete mental breakdown. His doctors initially suggested he was suffering from burnout, but the true culprit was much more specific and insidious. He was experiencing cognitive leakage, where the energy his brain used to maintain the memory of Clara and the letter was bleeding into his professional decision-making. Research conducted by psychologists at Florida State University has shown that even small, trivial unfinished tasks can significantly lower a person's effective IQ in the moment. When participants were interrupted during a word puzzle and then asked to complete a complex logic test, their scores plummeted compared to those who finished the puzzle first. This is because the brain's executive function is a finite resource, and the Zeigarnik effect acts like a background app on a smartphone that slowly drains the battery. For Elias, the app of his unsent letter had been running for 20 years, consuming the mental processing power he needed for his architectural blueprints. He was living his life in a state of permanent, low-power mode, unaware that the solution wasn't to work harder, but to close the program entirely. The neurobiology of this phenomenon is tied to the concept of anticipatory anxiety, where the brain prepares for a resolution that never comes. When we intend to do something, the brain creates a mental representation of the completed action and the expected reward. Because Elias never sent the letter, his brain never received the sensory feedback of the envelope sliding into the slot or the emotional feedback of a response. Without this feedback, the brain stays in a state of high alert, constantly scanning the environment for cues that might help it finish the task. This is why Elias felt a jolt of electricity every time he saw a blue mailbox. His brain was recognizing a task-relevant stimulus and trying to force him into action. This constant state of readiness triggers the release of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, which can lead to chronic fatigue and a weakened immune system. Scientific studies have linked the inability to let go of past regrets to higher levels of systemic inflammation, suggesting that the Zeigarnik effect isn't just a mental problem, but a biological one. Elias's body was literally reacting to his unfinished business as if it were a physical wound that refused to heal. He began to realize that his architecture of regret was actually a prison built out of his own neurotransmitters. To break free, he had to understand the endowment effect of memory, where we overvalue the things we didn't do, simply because we have invested so much mental energy in them over the years. Elias decided to consult a specialist who focused on the psychology of closure, hoping to find a way to evict the ghost of Clara from his mind. The specialist explained that the brain does actually need the original person or the original situation to be present to close a loop. This is because the brain cannot perfectly distinguish between a vivid mental rehearsal and a real-world event, concept known as neuroplasticity through visualization. The specialist introduced Elias to a technique based on the research of Dr. James Pennebaker, who found that expressive writing can reset the brain's memory priority. By writing down the full story of the letter, the feelings involved, and the imagined outcomes, Elias could move the information from the active workspace of his prefrontal cortex to the narrative storage of his long-term memory. This process, known as labeling, reduces the activity in the amygdala and allows the brain to finally categorize the event as over. Elias was skeptical that a simple writing exercise could undo 2 decades of neurological habit, but he was desperate enough to try. He sat down at his drafting table, not to draw a building, but to finally map out the landscape of his own regret. He wrote to the Clara he remembered, the one who lived in the amber of his 20-year-old memory, and explained why he had turned away from the mailbox. As he wrote, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, a loosening of a knot that had been tied since his youth. The science behind this writing cure is robust. It works by forced sequencing of a chaotic memory. When a memory is an open loop, it is often stored as a fragmented collection of images, smells, and emotions that lack a clear beginning, middle, and end. By turning those fragments into a linear story, Elias was giving his brain the closure it had been seeking through the Zeigarnik effect. He was effectively telling his hippocampus that the task was no longer pending, but was now historical. This shift allows the brain to stop the constant refreshing of the memory, which suddenly frees up a massive amount of cognitive bandwidth. For the first time in years, Elias found that he could look at a blue mailbox without feeling a pang of sorrow. He wasn't forgetting Clara, but he was changing the way his brain stored her from a to-do list item to a library book. This is the ultimate goal of understanding the architecture of our regrets, to turn our hauntings into history. Elias's journey shows us that the brain is not a static recorder of events, but a dynamic organ that can be retrained. We are not doomed to be the victims of our unfinished symphonies if we learn how to write the final notes ourselves. However, as Elias would soon discover, closing one loop often reveals the existence of others that were hidden beneath the surface. The architecture of the mind is complex, and dismantling one pillar often requires us to look at the entire foundation of how we make choices. While Elias had begun to clear the personal ghosts from his mental attic, he soon realized that the Zeigarnik effect wasn't just a source of pain. It was also a potent engine for creativity. Scientists at the University of California have discovered that incubation, the process where a solution to a problem appears while you are doing something else, is entirely dependent on keeping a loop open. When Elias stopped obsessing over his regret, he noticed a strange phenomenon in his drafting studio. By intentionally leaving a complex design unfinished at the end of the day, he found that his brain would present him with the perfect solution the moment he woke up the next morning. This is because the Zeigarnik effect keeps the problem-solving neurons in a state of low-level excitation even while we sleep. If you finish a task completely before bed, your brain deletes the working files, and you have to start from scratch the next day. But by leaving a bridge to cross a specific, unresolved creative tension, Elias was leveraging his brain as natural hatred of incompleteness to do the heavy lifting for him. He began to see his work not as a series of chores to be finished, but as a series of loops to be managed with precision. This is the Dali method, named after the artist Salvador Dali, who would famously nap with a key in his hand to wake himself up the moment he fell into a deep sleep, catching the open loops of his subconscious mind. The research suggests that there is a Goldilocks zone for the Zeigarnik effect in the professional world. If you have too many open loops, you experience the cognitive leakage and burnout that Elias suffered from in his earlier years. However, if you have zero open loops, you become stagnant and lose the creative itch that drives innovation. Elias began to categorize his projects into active loops and archive files. He realized that the stress of his past wasn't caused by the number of things he had to do, but by the lack of a system of record for them. When your brain doesn't trust that you have a reliable way to handle a task, it will keep reminding you of it at 3 a.m. This is the biological basis for modern productivity systems like Getting Things Done, which rely on the idea that writing a task down tricks the Zeigarnik effect into releasing its grip. By externalizing his mental list on the paper, Elias was effectively telling his prefrontal cortex that it could stand down because the information was safe. This offloading of memory to external devices is known as transactive memory, and it is one of the most important adaptations of the modern human brain. As Elias applied these scientific principles, his architectural style began to change, moving from rigid, closed structures to designs that invited interaction and incompleteness. He became fascinated by the concept of active architecture, where a building's purpose isn't fully realized until people move through it. This reflected his new understanding that a finished life is a dead one, and that a certain amount of unfinished business is what keeps us moving forward. He looked back at his obsession with the unsent letter and realized that the pain hadn't come from the lack of Clara, but from the frozen nature of the memory. By turning his regret into a narrative, he had liquidated the memory, allowing it to flow back into the stream of his life experience. Peer-reviewed studies on post-traumatic growth suggest that people who successfully process their regrets often report a heightened sense of empathy and a more complex understanding of the world. Elias found that he was no longer just an architect of stone and steel, but an architect of human experience. He started designing spaces that acknowledged the open loops of the people who used them, quiet corners for reflection and open plazas for chance encounters. However, the neurochemistry of the Zeigarnik effect has a darker side that Elias had to remain vigilant against: the dopamine trap of the digital age. Our smartphones are essentially Zeigarnik machines, designed to keep thousands of loops open at all times through red notification bubbles and infinite scrolling. Each unread message is an incomplete task that creates a tiny spike of cognitive tension, keeping our brains in a state of permanent, low-level stress. Scientists have found that the average person checks their phone over 150 times a day, largely driven by the subconscious need to close the loops created by these digital pings. For a brain already predisposed to regret and overthinking, this constant bombardment can lead to a state of digital exhaustion. Elias made the radical decision to gate his attention, treating his focus as the most precious material in his architectural toolkit. He learned that the brain needs white space, periods of time with no open loops, to repair its neural pathways and consolidate learning. This is where the architecture of regret finally transforms into the architecture of peace. By choosing which loops to leave open and which to close, Elias took back the blueprints of his own mind. He was no longer a passenger in his own head, driven by the winds of past omissions, but the deliberate captain of his current attention. As Elias mastered the art of closing his own internal loops, he began to look at his past relationships through a new scientific lens. He realized that the human brain doesn't just process its own unfinished tasks, but it is also hyper-tuned to the unfinished signals sent by others. In the realm of social psychology, the Zeigarnik effect is the hidden engine behind limerence and romantic obsession. When someone we care about stops communicating without explanation, they aren't just leaving our lives. They are forcibly leaving a high-stakes loop open in our primary motor cortex and our emotional centers. This is why ghosting is so much more painful than a clean breakup. A clean breakup, no matter how painful, provides a narrative closure that allows the brain to begin the archival process. Without that closure, the brain remains in a state of searching mode, constantly scanning past conversations and micro-expressions for a key to lock the door. Elias realized that by never sending that letter to Clara, he had essentially ghosted himself, leaving a massive social loop vibrating in his subconscious for decades. He was now beginning to see that our social health is entirely dependent on our ability to give and receive ends to our stories. Research using functional MRI scans has shown that the brain processes social rejection and unfinished social interactions in the same regions where it processes physical pain. Specifically, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up when we are denied closure, creating a sensation of heartache that is chemically indistinguishable from a physical injury. For Elias, the ghost of Clara wasn't just a memory. It was a chronic activation of his pain network. This explains why people will go to extreme lengths to get an answer from an ex-partner, even if they know the answer will be negative. The brain would literally rather hear, "I don't love you," than hear nothing at all, because the "I don't love you" allows the Zeigarnik loop to collapse. Scientists refer to this as the need for closure scale, and individuals who score high on this scale are often the most prone to chronic regret and anxiety. Elias began to see that his architectural obsession with structural integrity was a direct compensation for the lack of integrity in his social history. He was building skyscrapers that could withstand earthquakes because his own internal foundation had been shaken by a single unsent envelope. This social application of the Zeigarnik effect also explains the addictive nature of modern dating apps and social media interactions. These platforms are designed to maximize the number of open social loops in your life unread messages, seen, receipts with no reply, and the infinite potential of the next swipe. Each of these represents a pending social task that keeps your brain's dopamine system in a state of constant, itchy anticipation. Elias realized that the architecture of regret in the 21st century is built out of these digital fragments. We are no longer haunted by one big unsent letter like he was. We are haunted by 1,000 tiny digital whispers that never reached a shout. This leads to a state called social thinning, where our mental energy is spread so thin across so many open loops that we can no longer invest deeply in the person sitting right across from us. Elias decided to apply a structural audit to his social life, reaching out to old friends, not necessarily to rekindle the flame, but to settle the accounts of his history. He found that even a simple, "Hey, I was thinking about that project we never finished. I hope you're well," was enough to release the cognitive tension associated with that person. The most profound realization for Elias came when he understood that he was also responsible for the open loops in other people's lives. He looked back at the junior architects he had mentored and the partners he had left behind, wondering how many open files he had created in their brains. This is the ethical Zeigarnik effect, the realization that our silence can be a burden for someone else to carry. Research into accountability shows that when we apologize or provide an explanation, we aren't just being nice. We are performing a neurological service for the other person. We are helping them move a painful memory from their active workspace into their history books. Elias began a practice of closing circles, making a conscious effort to finish conversations and provide clear endings to his professional and personal engagements. He found that this didn't just help others. It actually increased his own social capital and reduced his stress levels. By becoming a person who provides closure, he was no longer an architect of fragments, but an architect of wholeness. He was finally learning that the most beautiful buildings are not the ones that stand alone, but the ones that provide a clear path for people to enter and eventually to leave. Elias eventually found himself facing a new kind of crisis, the paralyzing fear of the blank page. Even though he had cleared the ghosts of his past, he found that starting a new project felt like trying to move a mountain with a toothpick. This is a common trap for those who have spent years in the architecture of regret. Because they are so afraid of creating a new open loop of failure, they refuse to open the loop at all. However, the neurobiology of the Zeigarnik effect offers a surprising backdoor into productivity known as the 5-minute rule. This rule is built on the scientific fact that the brain's resistance to a task is highest before the task has begun. Once a task is initiated, the Zeigarnik effect flips from being your enemy to being your greatest ally. The moment you make a single mark on a page or write a single sentence of a report, the brain categorizes that task as incomplete rather than unstarted. This shift creates a psychological itch that can only be scratched by continuing the work. For Elias, this meant he stopped trying to design a whole building at once and instead committed to drawing just one window frame. As soon as that window existed on the paper, his brain's internal architect took over, nagged by the open loop of the missing wall attached to it. Research conducted at the University of Toronto has shown that procrastination is rarely a problem of time management, but rather a problem of emotion management. We procrastinate because a task makes us feel anxious, bored, or insecure, and our brain tries to protect us by avoiding those feelings. But the Zeigarnik effect proves that avoidance is actually more stressful than action. When you avoid a task, the loop stays open in the back of your mind, quietly draining your mental energy all day long. This is why you feel exhausted at the end of a day where you did absolutely nothing. You weren't resting. Your brain was busy running the procrastination program in the background, constantly reminding you of what you were avoiding. Elias realized that his laziness was actually a form of high-intensity mental labor. He began to practice intentional interruption, a technique where he would stop working right in the middle of a sentence or a complex calculation. By leaving the task in a clearly unfinished state, he ensured that his subconscious would keep working on it during his breaks. This made returning to work the next morning effortless, as his brain was already screaming for the resolution of the loop he had left open. The architecture of regret often flourishes in people with high standards because they view every unfinished task as a potential stain on their record. This leads to decision paralysis, where the fear of making the wrong choice results in making no choice at all. Elias learned that the only way to combat this was to lower the barrier to entry for his brain. Scientific studies have shown that breaking a large goal into microtasks reduces the activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. When Elias looked at a project as build a cathedral, his amygdala saw a threat to his reputation and triggered a freeze response. But when he looked at it as order a specific type of limestone, the task was small enough to bypass the fear response and activate the Zeigarnik itch. He began to view his life as a series of sprints rather than a marathon of perfection. This approach allowed him to close small loops quickly, providing his brain with a steady stream of dopamine hits that kept his motivation high. He was no longer waiting for inspiration to strike. He was using the mechanics of his own biology to manufacture momentum. Elias also discovered the completion bias, a cognitive shortcut where our brains prioritize finishing small, easy tasks over large, important ones. This is why you might spend 2 hours answering emails instead of working on the one big project that actually matters. Your brain is a completion junkie. It wants the quick hit of dopamine that comes from checking a box. Elias learned to gain this bias by stacking his tasks. He would start a large, difficult open loop first thing in the morning, and then use small, easy tasks as rewards throughout the day. This kept his brain engaged with the big project while still satisfying its craving for closure. He realized that the architecture of a productive life is not built on willpower, but on structure. By understanding how his brain processed done versus not done, he turned his mental prison into a powerhouse of efficiency. He was finally learning that the secret to not regretting your life is simply to keep the right loops open and the wrong ones closed. As he looked at his drafting table, now filled with progress rather than fragments, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was a boy. He had mastered the art of the start, and in doing so, he had finally learned how to finish. As Elias entered the final decade of his career, he noticed a subtle but profound shift in his internal landscape, one that science confirms is a natural part of the aging brain. Research into the socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests that as our time horizon shrinks, our brain naturally begins to prioritize positive emotional experiences over the stressful open loops of our youth. For Elias, this meant that the intense, buzzing tension of the Zeigarnik effect finally began to soften into a quiet, reflective wisdom. He no longer felt the itch to fix every mistake or answer every what-if from his past. Scientific studies using brain imaging have shown that older adults often show decreased activity in the amygdala in response to negative stimuli compared to younger adults. This positivity effect allowed Elias to look back at the unsent letter to Clara not as a structural failure of his life, but as a necessary shadow that gave the rest of his story depth. He realized that the architecture of regret is only a prison if you refuse to walk through the doors you've already built. By acknowledging the Zeigarnik effect, he had gained the power to choose which memories deserved a seat on his stage and which were merely background noise. Elias decided to make one final journey back to his hometown, not to find Clara, who had moved on to a life of her own long ago, but to stand once more in front of that blue mailbox. When he arrived, he found that the post office had been replaced by a small community garden. The physical trigger for his 20-year obsession was gone, yet his brain didn't panic. This is because he had successfully reconsolidated the memory through the techniques of narrative and labeling we explored earlier. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, had allowed Elias to physically change the neural pathways associated with that moment of hesitation. He stood in the garden and felt a sense of autobiographical completion, a state where the various chapters of one's life finally feel like a cohesive book rather than a pile of loose pages. Research by Dr. Erik Erikson on the stages of psychosocial development calls this integrity versus despair. By facing his open loops, Elias had achieved integrity, the ability to look back on his life, including its omissions, and say, it was enough. The final lesson Elias learned was that the Zeigarnik effect is actually a gift of the human condition. It is the brain's way of saying that we are still under construction, that our story isn't over yet. If we remembered everything we did perfectly and forgot everything we didn't do, we would become stagnant, self-satisfied creatures with no drive to improve. The mental itch of the incomplete is what pushes the scientist to find the cure, the artist to finish the mural, and the person to seek a better version of themselves tomorrow. Elias realized that his most successful buildings were the ones that left room for the unexpected, just as his most successful years were the ones where he embraced his own imperfections. He took a seat on a wooden bench in the garden and pulled out a small sketchbook. For the first time in his life, he didn't draw a plan for a building that needed to be perfect. He drew the garden as it was half-bloomed, slightly overgrown, and beautifully incomplete. As we close this exploration of the architecture of regret, we must look at our own blue mailboxes. We all have letters we didn't send, apologies we didn't make, and dreams we left in the coat pocket of our youth. But as the story of Elias and the science of the Zygarnik effect show us, these are not weights meant to sing us. They are signals from a brain that is designed to keep trying, keep solving, and keep living. You can close the loops that drain you by writing your story down, by making a plan, or by simply accepting that some chapters don't need a happy ending to be finished. The ghosts in your machine are just energy looking for a place to go. When you understand the biology of your regret, you stop being a victim of your past and start being the architect of your future. Elias walked away from the garden that day with light steps, his active workspace finally clear and his mind at rest. He had finally finished the most important project of his career, himself. And in the quiet space where the regret used to live, he finally heard the music of the present moment, a symphony that was, for once, perfectly complete just as it was.